يشارك في الجلسة السيد ستيفن آلموند من مكتب مفوضية المعلومات بحكومة المملكة المتحدة، ودكتور أكرم عوض من شركة BCG، والسيد جون مارشال من مؤسسة ومنتدى World Ethical Data، ويديرها السيد مصطفى الراوي، إعلامي من شبكة CNN الاقتصادية. A panel session featuring Stephen Almond from Information Commissioner's Office, UK Government, Dr. Akram Awad from BCG, and John Marshall from World Ethical Data Foundation, moderated by Mustafa Al-Rawi from CNN Business, is about to start now.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us. We're going to have a fascinating discussion for about the next 20 minutes to do with regulation and AI. I'm sure you've heard a lot today and yesterday touching upon this subject, but I think we're going to go into a deep dive with our panelists. I'm very happy to say at the end we have Stephen Almond, who's Executive Director of Regulatory Risk of the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK. We have Dr. Akram Awad, who's a partner at BCG here. And we have John Marshall, who's at the World Ethical Data Foundation. So this is good. I'm going to start with Stephen at the end because I kind of really want to understand what and who are we regulating and who are we regulating for when it comes to AI?
Thank you. So look, for those of you who don't know what the Information Commissioner's Office is, we are the UK's privacy data protection regulator, and actually one of the largest in the world. And really, what I want to talk about when it comes to regulating AI is that we're not actually regulating AI itself. We no more than we are should regulate computing or mathematics. But actually, what we should always be thinking about is regulating the use of AI, the application of it in, as we've heard so far, finance, in medicine, in different areas of society, and making sure that good outcomes are achieved. So it's all about regulating in the public interest.
And John, if I turn to you, from what Stephen's saying, not to directly challenge what he's saying, because he's talking about the perspective that his organization is coming from. But there is a tension that currently exists in terms of regulation and tech in general. But in particular, when it comes to AI, there are some forces that are pushing and pulling against each other.
I think it's a really interesting space for many reasons. We're seeing regulators, sorry, just one second. We're seeing regulators globally worrying precisely about what it would even mean to regulate AI, because the definition is a point of contention in itself. And then we look at GenAI and the enormous complexity internal, I think, to the industry, that a foundation model is not an application. It is a whole enterprise of activities and participants, and we have an ecosystem of very complicated supply chains, from the material that produces, the processes in the first place, the rare earths and how they're handled, and ethical considerations and compliance that goes into that, all the way through to, I think most importantly, the accumulation or extraction of data, something that you've done a lot of work on. So the tensions are manifold. There's tensions between the open source and the closed source communities, who's borrowing from whom, in which ways. There's tensions of supply chain considerations to do with who's responsible or who's accountable, and the transfer of accountability throughout the supply chain. Where the data comes from, the legitimacy of the data that's used to train and source the models that are so important for GenAI. And how much transparency or how much intransparency there is in the supply chain as well. So frankly, are people even aware that they're building risk or liability into the creation of the technologies? So at a very high level, we have many different dimensions to the problem at many different layers, and there's a great deal of ambiguity and uncertainty. So the final thing I'll say to summarize is that another tension is between that the sense in some that regulation is there to limit or constrain, powerful tech companies, but at the same time we hear all the time from smaller tech companies as well as big tech companies that they're putting their own innovations on ice because they're afraid of the ambiguities or uncertainties of regulation, and so they're desperately calling for it, just not too much of it.
We're trying to pick through some of those challenges, and we're not going to resolve them in the next 15 minutes, but I mean, Akram, if I turn to you, you're advising clients in this region regarding AI, how it kind of touches both the public and private sectors. Is what has been described so far this morning something that you're seeing in your day-to-day?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we usually look into this, as we advise both governments and the private sectors, the starting conversation is always about whether we regulate the technology or whether we regulate the usage of technology. For example, let's say AI in the context of healthcare. But we always push to look into the bigger picture. And this is what's usually ignored, but where actually practically is where the real effect comes from. And I'll give you two concrete examples from real experiences. And let's focus on data regulations, because really at the heart of getting AI right. If you look into data privacy regulations and the way how sensitive data should be used, I've been in conversations with organizations that have not been able to unlock the potential of generative AI, for example, for the last 12 months or so, because they work in heavily regulated sectors. And I'll give you even one concrete example, healthcare insurance. This is like the worst of the worst. You have heavily regulated healthcare sector and heavily regulated finance and banking and insurance sector, while the typical value would come from using the data that the organization have and training AI or fine-tuning with that data. These guys are simply not able to do that because the data has to stay within their boundaries. So either they have to build their own supercomputers, which will just basically make the whole business case invalid, or basically just live with the fact that they have to always be behind. Another example is data sovereignty and cross-border data regulations. Now, there are parts of the world, if you look into the US, Europe, where there is abundance of kind of AI-enabled public cloud capabilities, the likes of Google, AWS, Microsoft, where any organizations can go and use that capacity. But there are also parts of the world where that is not necessarily available, which basically means that it's impossible for companies or startups or academia to tap on that capability that is just taken for granted in different parts of the world because of the strict cross-data and data sovereignty regulations, which will not allow using basically cross-border cloud offering for certain applications.
Could I ask a question? So sovereignty in this context is sovereignty to, for whom, or is it self-sovereignty for individuals?
It's the sovereignty of the nation. Okay, and good. Basically where some of the sensitive data should sit and cannot be relocated.
Okay. The reason I ask is that that's sometimes a point of concern for various countries. Switzerland, for example, is very suspicious of the coherence of the idea of data sovereignty at the nation-state level. We've also been really well behaved, not mentioning use case once so far, which is the complicating factor with GenAI.
Are you asking me?
I was just wondering if I have permission, because the further complication to do with regulation of GenAI particularly is this weird ambiguity between the uses of the technology, but their complementarity. So, we are talking in a very polite way as if everybody's well behaved and people are, all in the business of just having nice chatbots, or they're going to generate medical applications, when in fact, the very same technologies can be used for the most remarkable, I think, and interestingly disruptive purposes. A fantastic instance would be, I might want to mimic the poetry of James Joyce, and I'll train my model upon the resources of James Joyce and my great libraries of his poetry. My friend, however, may want to just have a really malicious bit of malware that is able to disguise itself and get around automated cybersecurity defenses. And
I think Stephen wants to jump in.
Sorry, Stephen.
Yeah, so look, I'd really love to just kind of delve into the use cases a little bit and just pick up the point that you were saying there around different accountabilities across the AI supply chain. Because even when the technology fundamentally is the same, so let's take sort of a chatbot, for example, a chatbot that is used in a cinema clearly has very different implications, and actually we would expect kind of a lot higher level of rigor if that same chatbot was used for medical advice, for example. And so much of what we have to do here is think about the regulation and frankly the principles here needing to apply at the two levels. How does this apply to the foundation models? And we've heard from lots of foundation model developers during the event so far. But also, how does it apply when people take those models and fine-tune them and apply them in their context? And what risks, what issues should people be thinking about there?
I mean, Akram, if I bring you back to you, because if we think from a regional point of view, what you were saying before essentially was what played out with the tech startup scene, which is no tech startup has really been able to take advantage of the scale of the region in the same way that has happened in other parts of the world. And there is a risk that even with AI, even with the power of AI, that same thing will play out now. Do we need to move to essentially what Stephen and John are saying is to think about principles and ethics and people first, work that out, and then once we have that, then we can perhaps move on to unlock some of these silos and some of these barriers that we have.
Yeah. See, I think we all agree that there is a general set of AI ethical principles that no one basically is disputing. And in particular, there are 193 countries that signed up or approved the UNESCO recommendation on AI. So that really sets the foundation. However, when it comes to the practicality of how you apply that, then there will be a lot of nuisances, and it's almost impossible to separate the application of AI ethics, or responsible AI, as you call it, from the cultural, the social, and even the economic context. And let me give you an example here. There is an overly negative conversation or messages around AI and the risks of AI. However, here in the region, we actually have, in general, a very different perception. I mean, just the other day, Stanford came with a report that indicated that KSA, for example, ranked second in the world when it comes to the positive perception of AI. Now, that can have different interpretations, but at least one interpretation is the fact that you have a heavily young generation, over 70% of the population below 30 years, very much tech-savvy. Their expectations are actually to be even served more and more with digital, including AI. So what do you do? Now, some might think that that's a reason not to apply the ethical rules. I would say no, it's absolutely not the case. It's the complete opposite. It just puts more responsibility on the governments and on the technology service providers to be even more conscious and more self-abiding, while still being practical and pragmatic in the way how they serve responsible AI. And I think that's very important. But also, the other nuisances. And I'll give you here one concrete example. Even the interpretation of some of these principles can be different. When we typically talk about inclusive AI or the kind of avoiding bias in AI, what do we typically talk about? We talk about gender bias, men and women, color, black and white, and some of these interpretations. Look into the region here. We have been pioneering whether it's places like United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia, the topic of Arabic language technology and Arabic AI. But if you think about it, is this enough and is this inclusive enough, given that there is a big segment of the society whose language actually is not Arabic, and many of them do not even speak English, which raises the question of what does inclusivity mean in that context?
So we move on to access or enforcement. I mean, where do we go from here, Steve?
Lots of the regulation in this space isn't new. I know we've all got very excited with the kind of the surge with ChatGPT over the last year, but AI has been around for a long period of time, and the principles of how to regulate it actually have been around. You know, the questions around fairness and bias, of transparency and explainability, of safety, of security, of accountability and redress. These already exist and in many jurisdictions are already placed in law. So one of my major areas of focus actually is on making sure that organisations that are using the data of UK residents are complying with those laws. And we're seeing a number of interesting cases. Over a year ago, my office took action against Clearview AI that was gathering images of people from the public web and using it to train facial recognition technology, which it then sold on to the police in a way which we considered wasn't fair or transparent. We've now seen a wave of action from different authorities in relation to generative AI. So earlier this year, some of you will have seen action taken by the Italian Data Protection Authority in relation to OpenAI's ChatGPT, questions around transparency there. Just last week, my office announced, and I should be clear, that this is a preliminary enforcement notice in relation to Snap regarding their My AI tool. And we're going through that process. We're open to the representations from Snap in relation to their take on how this has been introduced. But our findings from that initial investigation that we'd undertaken were that actually some of those critical risks that needed to be assessed hadn't been sufficiently assessed and hadn't been sufficiently mitigated before introduction to market.
I mean, John, this is your area. I mean, data is, and the ethical use of it is what you're looking at, and ensuring that it is a balanced and fair approach. Does it just come down to that? I mean, I know I'm making it very, very simple, but is it just how we control or don't control how people use data that resolves this?
No, not at all. I mean, I think it's really interesting that issues of inclusivity and explainability were mentioned. It's one thing to have an organization meet certain criteria specified by some body that has them qualify as explainable. That in some sense, the workings of the tool or the AI or the model is intelligible. But the principles behind that, rather than the technical details, are much more interesting. Is again, why do we want explainable technology at all? And that's bound up with questions of justice. You know, how is an individual to be able to enforce their rights before a judge if they don't understand the technology? They don't know where their freedoms or their rights are being transgressed by technology companies. So imagine, Clearview was a black box foundation, really complicated foundation model, rather than the architecture that it had. It might have been a much more complicated case to bring, I would imagine.
And I think this really speaks to the role of the institutions in this space. I don't think that we can rely on the public and consumers at large to be able to understand and directly challenge some of the issues that they may see with AI, because actually where the processing is hidden from view, it is very difficult to interrogate that. So actually what we do require is that culture of responsibility at every level, in the organisation themselves, in industry bodies that provide assurance around this, so the role of standards and of self-governance in this space, the role of regulators, and of course the role of international conversations like this, because actually so many of these applications done well will be crossing multiple markets.
Could I say one more thing, which is that, I skipped your question somewhat, but the role of ethics in this instance is it's a conceptual labor. It's lots of working out what's meant by certain things. So just as with I think enforcement and explainability is a really important part of enabling competent institutions or bodies, as well as individuals, to know what's happening to them. Companies to know, in some sense, what their consequences are going to be of their technologies. That's all sort of really, really important stuff. But the working out, I think, of the elements that we're looking to balance in the first place is one of the most important prior tasks that we have to be doing in the first instance. So two very quick instances. Explainability was a sticking point in 2018 in Europe, where they introduced a regulation that said, look, if your technology is affecting a European citizen in a way that seems to sort of contravene its rights in some way, you need to be able to explain exactly what you're doing. The problem with that is that at a single stroke, they rendered questionable deep learning and sophisticated technologies, and it looked as though, badly regulated, ambiguous regulation would debilitate the entire industry in some instances.
I mean, it's a moving target then. I mean, we come back to the tensions. I mean, Akram, you worried about, for example, artificial general intelligence now and where that takes us in the cycle, because, we regulate, but we don't know what's coming down the pipe.
I mean, it's true. And I think the lesson learned from the previous cycle of the last 12 months or so is basically the fact that if anything we got it wrong is that we didn't do our homework early enough. We have been talking about kind of the disruptive potential of AI for many years, but we were always taken by surprise when generative AI came, which really shows we were just theorizing a lot instead of actually doing homework and be prepared. Not just in terms of regulations on what is too risky and needs to be stopped, or basically, but even in terms of what are the foundations for all the multi-layers, the individuals, the companies, and of course, first of all, the countries need to do in order to fully unlock the positive potential of that. So I think that the lessons learned is that we need to keep that eye on the future. I think people maybe do not necessarily understand the point when we say that it will get to existential risk when it comes to AGI, but AGI is far away. We're still at least a few decades away from there. But as we get into the journey, the risks will evolve stronger and stronger, which kind of, it's really important with that everyone works together extremely collaboratively to keep an eye, to create the likes of observatories where technology trends are clearly identified. As things become mature, the risks are identified, the enablers are identified, the areas where regulations are necessary to avoid, again, being taken by surprise by the next GenAI moment. And let me generalize that. It's not just AI. Metaverse is going to come. Blockchain is going to come. 3D printing is going to come. Biotech is going to come. And each of them will have very soon its GenAI moment.
We're going to have to, I think it's a good point to leave it, which is all possibilities open, nothing resolved, which I think that we need to keep talking. But thank you so much for being here for this discussion. Please join me in thanking our panelists for the last 20 minutes or so of insights. Thank you so much.